So without any further ado, I shall hand over to our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. Over to you, Alice.
Hello, good afternoon. Conhounder. My voice is failing me a little bit this afternoon because hay fever is horrible. I'm sure some people can relate. So I am a national disability training and consultancy specialist, which makes me feel more important than I am, which is always wonderful. And I have a particular interest in neurodiversity. I grew up in a really neurodiverse household, and I knew about autism from a very, very young age. So I'm really looking forward to today's webinar. Pass you over to
Hi,
Lizzie.
everyone. Hi, thanks, Alice. I'm Lizzie, and I am part of Medigold's Workplace Adjustments Programme team. I'm a disability advisor and a vocational rehabilitation consultant. And I am very excited today as I was late diagnosed autistic and ADHD.
Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks, Alice. My name's Kim. I work in the same team as Alice. So what we do on a day-to-day really is focus on working with organisations to upskill them, upskill their knowledge on all areas of disability. So autism, neurodiversity, anything that falls under that umbrella, as well as mental health, menopause, etc. And yes, really excited to get started. I'll be starting you off today and talking you through the introductions, and then I'll hand over to Alice and Lizzie. So the aims really today from the webinar is to first of all do a high level view of what autism is, and then I'll hand over to Alice, who will talk us through masking and how it can lead to autistic burnout, which is very different to workplace burnout as you might know it, and she'll be able to talk us through the differences between those. And then hand over to Lizzie, who will talk us through how to implement adjustments and to support people who might have been masking for quite some time, which has led to autistic burnout. Okay. I want to highlight as well that this focus will be on masking and burnout, but we do have other kind of sessions or general kind of awareness and knowledge leaflets and things on what autism is. So if you do want to find out more information on autism generally, please reach out to one of our team or visit our website. So autism fits under the umbrella term neurodiversity, which I'm sure most of you have probably heard of before. And the quote that you can see on the screen is from Harvard Medical School. And it's a really good starting point, really, to understand what neurodiversity means. So it describes the different ways our brains develop and function. It's all about thinking differently. And actually, when we look at neurodiversity, it should be respected in the same way as other different kind of variations we have, like gender, sexuality, race, etc. So again, should be considered in the same way. So the term neurodiverse is a collective term, so a group of people or a community or a condition will be called neurodiverse, but a person will be referred to as neurodivergent. People that, without this different way of thinking, will be often referred to as neurotypical. You might have heard of that before as well. Okay. So as this diagram illustrates, there's an overlap really between various conditions you can see on the screen, and you've probably heard of those before as well. And you can have one or more of these diagnosed conditions, and all of them will absolutely have a range of symptoms which can overlap. Okay, so some of these symptoms will be shared. So we've covered neurodiversity, which is an umbrella term and which is where autism fits. It's looking at the term autism, highlighting the different sets of skills, abilities and ways of thinking that people have. Okay, you might have heard of the phrase learning difficulties. So going back to neurodiversity, learning difficulties is deemed more negative, focusing on issues and problems, whereas neurodiversity is more of a collective term that people might prefer.
Just a quick one, sorry to interrupt you, Kim. Yeah. When you speak forward, it's a lot clearer. A few people have mentioned, yeah, when you're sort of when it seems to go a little bit kind of underwatery. When a few people have commented, but I've noticed when you're speaking forward, it seems a little bit clearer. Sorry to interrupt your flow there, but I just wanted to check you can hear that. That's a lot better.
No problem. I'll bring my face closer. Apologies, everybody.
I do apologise. Thank you.
No
Thank
problem.
you, people, for flagging it up as well.
Yeah, thank you. If it does happen again, please just flag in the chat and let me know. So neurodiversity, umbrella term of which autism fits under it. Now, when we were looking at autism, you might have seen many different diagrams. You might have heard of the spectrum and the rainbow diagrams and things like that. But autism is not related to intelligence, or at least it shouldn't be referred to as your higher intelligence or low intelligence. It can occur across all different levels of intelligence. So every autistic individual will have strengths or difficulties across all of the functions, and each person's pattern will be very different. So some people might have strengths in language, some might be confident in having a conversation, but some people might have difficulties in sensory processing, so would struggle maybe in busy or loud environments. Others might be fine in loud environments, but have difficulty with starting conversations, for example. So you can really see there's a different way to look at it, because every single person will have a different makeup of the colours, as you can see on the screen, depending on the impact of those symptoms. So this rainbow spectrum, which I really like, is from neuroclastic.com, and it's a website about autism by autistic people. And these rainbow of traits all affect people differently. Okay, everyone will have their own kind of makeup of colours. So if you only check 1 or 2 boxes, for example, they might not be referred to as autistic or have autism. You might call that something else. So for example, if you only struggle with, let's say, communication, they'll call that a social communication disorder, for example. If you only have problems with body or movement or control, that might be called dyspraxia or a developmental coordination disorder. So you can see the pattern here, that it's likely if you have the majority of these traits that you might have autism, okay? But every single person's dominant colour palette will look differently. So neurodiversity, autism falling under it, we have an understanding of that, hopefully. I wanted to discuss the impact of language when we're supporting someone either in a professional capacity or otherwise. And it's fair to say that generally speaking, our experiences of autism come from when we're children, right? We see our first experiences when we're children in the classroom. And largely, it's a negative, people will see this as a negative experience. They'll view it in a negative way. And what we're saying here is that actually this negative stigma is slowly being removed, and we're working towards a space where we're not seeing this, and we're changing the culture and changing that stigma. So the phrase "they are autistic" is a bit of a trick one here. They are autistic. People were moving away from it because it was deemed negative. So saying something like "they have autism," because you are not the sum total of your diagnosis. So being autistic is a set of symptoms. But actually what we're noticing now is a trend where people are reclaiming that they are autistic, because it isn't a negative thing. So the big point here is asking somebody what their preference is. How would somebody like to be referred to as? Okay, if somebody would like to be referred to as autistic, great. Somebody wants to be referred to as they have autism, great. Best thing to do is ask somebody. Now, other spaces around kind of stigma and judgments are maybe behaviours that you might not be deemed as neurotypical. Because remember, we're talking about difference, and difference is a good thing. It isn't a negative thing. But you do hear quite a lot of stigma around it being weird, or they're behaving in a different way. Now, this might be due to stimming, which is something that somebody might do to support them in environments that might be challenging for them. So again, the point here is to think about what behaviours is somebody displaying and how can we support them. Yeah, saying what we see and asking them how we can support them. Which brings us to, if somebody does have a diagnosis of autism in the workplace, for example, let's ask them, how does this impact you? Rather than assuming somebody might struggle. Because as we saw on the last diagram, every single person's colour palette will be different. So let's ask them, how is this impacting you and how can we help? Lizzie will talk us through a bit later, a bit more focus on workplace adjustments and bringing this to life a little bit more. But moving on from this then, I'm going to set the scene a little bit before we hand over to Alice. So talking about some of the statistics around autism. So the first statistic on the screen, 1.1% of the population in the UK have a diagnosis of autism. So here we're saying it's prevalent, it's there. We need to be supporting people with this diagnosis. A lot of people are not diagnosed, but will have some of these traits and symptoms as well. So again, might not be the reality of the world. The second statistic is really looking at the workplace. 21% of people with autism are in employment. Again, in the reality of the world, it might be a lot higher. But what we're saying is we need to be talking about it more so in the workplace to be able to provide support and adjustments. The third one here is around burnout. 80% of people with autism will experience burnout at some point. I don't know about you, but that reads really highly to us, quite a high number. So again, hopefully for those on the webinar, highlights the prevalence of this burnout and the need to learn about it and support people. Similarly, the last statistic, 94% of autistic adults have masked at some point in their lives. Okay, so again, highlighting the need to learn about masking and burnout, which leads me to Alice to talk more about that.
Awesome, thanks, Kim. Love that we're reclaiming autistic as well. I think it's a great word. For a long time we didn't use it because it was used as an insult, and now I think no, let's claim it back. So thank you very much. Can we all hear me okay? Is my mic all right? Nods? Perfect. Okay, so on the screen there's a quote from Devon Price, who's the author of Unmasking Autism, and they're describing their own personal view of masking. So though masking is incredibly taxing and causes us a lot of existential turmoil, it's rewarded and facilitated by neurotypical people. So masking makes autistic people easier to deal with. It renders us compliant and quiet, and it also traps us. Once you've proven yourself to be capable of suffering in silence, neurotypical people tend to expect you'll be able to do it forever, no matter the cost, which is a lot. Okay, so what is it? I mean, to mask means to hide or disguise part of yourself in order to better fit in with those who are around you. It can begin as an entirely subconscious strategy that all human beings learn and develop while we're growing up, to help us connect with other people around us. But for people with autism, that strategy is often much more ingrained and potentially even harmful to their health and well-being. So I asked a friend of mine what masking was to them, and they said, and I quote, that they felt like 3 raccoons in a trench coat masquerading as a human being. Now, as humorous as that image might be, if we just think about it for a moment, that's quite intense, because more often than not, an autistic person might feel like they have to spend their whole lives hiding their traits and trying to fit in, experiencing this greater pressure to hide their true selves and fit into this non-autistic culture, for fear, really, for fear of being perceived as different or weird. Masking's sometimes referred to as camouflaging or social camouflaging, because that's exactly what it is. It's a conscious effort to blend into the surroundings. So autistic people have described masking as a hypervigilance for and constant adaptation to the preferences and expectations of other people around us, or tightly controlling and adjusting how you express yourself. And that includes your needs, your preferences, your opinions, your interests, your personality, your mannerisms, the list goes on, all based on either the real or anticipated reactions of other people, both in the present moment and over time. Now, masking is incredibly personal, and it can mean different things to different people. So because of that, it's not always straightforward when we're trying to spot it, but there are a few things that might stand out to those of us who are particularly observant. Okay. Now, research suggests that autistic people learn to mask by observing, analysing, and mirroring the behaviours of others. Now, that could be in real life, but it might also be through films and TV programs and even books. So examples of that, which can be done completely consciously or unconsciously, include things like using facial expressions. So that might be by mirroring other people, using expressions that wouldn't necessarily come naturally to you. It might be forcing yourself to make eye contact, or being hypervigilant and monitoring how much eye contact you're making and knowing what's socially acceptable. It could be changing your speech or tone of voice, so using less direct phrasing or being more or less animated. I can't help that. My watch always says I've done way more steps than I have, because I have a habit of speaking with my hands. It could be suppressing stimming, or even reducing or hiding stimming. So things like hand flapping might be quite common, particularly in children, or echolalia, which is more common in adults. So that's when someone repeats certain words or phrases or noises just because it's comforting. Or they might switch to less noticeable, more socially acceptable stims. So playing with a pen, playing with their hair, playing with jewelry, that kind of thing. Could be asking more questions. So probably more questions that you're comfortable with, or asking things that you're not even interested in, just because you think society wants you to ask questions because that's the done thing. It might be not sharing interests. Yeah, you might be worried that it's perceived as unusual or inappropriate. And a common thing is mirroring dress sense, and mirroring personalities and behaviors of other people. Now, when we think about it, it takes an incredible amount of energy to be permanently masking, because you have to be in this state of high alert at all time. It's like being in a permanent state of fight or flight. Now, there are lots of reasons as to why a person might be masking. That can include a want or a need to blend into this neurotypical world. It might be to hide discomfort in certain environments, or to be accepted, or to avoid prejudice. But for some people, it's because it's become so routine and subconscious that they don't really know any other way. But being in that constant state of alert can have a significant negative impact on a person, both short-term and long-term. So masking and suppressing your basic needs, instincts, and preferences can result in a myriad of issues, okay, affecting all aspects of a person's being. So masking is thought to be common in autistic people, but truly there's no way of really measuring it. Because like Kim said, autism is a spectrum condition. So there's no one way to look autistic. And the way that people mask varies quite drastically. That common thing, though, is the negative impact that it can have on that person's well-being. So long-term masking can result in distressed behavior, and that includes meltdowns and shutdowns. And when you think of a meltdown, you probably wouldn't be alone in picturing what's essentially a tantrum. And it goes back to what Kim said, okay? Because most of us are first introduced to autism in childhood. And children, particularly autistic children, aren't necessarily as well equipped at dealing with their emotions because they haven't had the time or the space to develop that resilience and those coping mechanisms. So meltdowns and shutdowns in adults can look quite drastically different. According to a 2022 research study, autistic adults describe the sensation of being entirely out of control, so experiencing blurred vision, tense muscles, and a warmth in various body parts. But there's also the emotional symptoms, so extreme rage, crying, and even panic attacks. Now, another impact of masking is low self-esteem and a loss of a sense of self, really. Because like I've said, masking can be entirely subconscious and so deeply ingrained that a person doesn't always realize that they're doing it. But with that comes the risk of losing your own identity. Because if you constantly have to stop yourself from expressing who you are, then a time might come when you begin to question your own identity and even potentially grieve the person that you might have become if you hadn't have been masking and suppressing yourself your entire life. And masking can lead to vulnerability. So something a lot of people don't talk about, because if you blend in by constantly overriding your reactions and just going along with what other people want, it might not keep you safe in certain situations. So an example of that in the workplace is being a yes man. Yeah, so simply just saying yes and doing things, even if it has a negative impact on you. And I'll be honest, there are loads of potential impacts, but one of the biggest ones is mental and physical exhaustion, because over time, that's a one-way ticket to autistic burnout. So exhaustion, fatigue, and then burnout can happen to anyone, but being autistic can make fatigue and burnout a lot more likely, just due to the pressures of social situations and sensory overload. So we need to ask, is burnout, an autistic burnout, different to what a neurotypical person would describe as burnout? Well, I think the author of The New Normal, David Gray Hammond, explains their vision of autistic burnout perfectly. And again, it's another semi-humorous quote, but it really hits home. So it's like achieving basic daily objectives while on burnout. It's like trying to perform complex surgery with a 50-kilogram weight around all of your limbs while your brain struggles to process how to hold a scalpel. That's a lot. Okay, now while someone with occupational burnout will feel chronically stressed due to the pressures of their work, someone with autistic burnout will feel chronically stressed due to the pressures of living, working, and merely existing in a neurotypical world. Now, it's interesting because the term burnout was actually coined in the 1970s by Dr. Herbert Freudenberger, who was a German-American psychologist. And he described it as a state of physical and mental exhaustion caused by one's professional life. In 2015, the World Health Organization actually included burnout in the International Classification of Diseases, and so it did become an official clinical disorder. And autistic burnout differs greatly from classical burnout. And although autistic burnout isn't a clearly defined medical term or even a formal diagnosis, it is common and it is a widely discussed experience, especially in those who've learned to mask their autistic traits to the point where their true support needs aren't being recognized. So autistic people experience burnout at points in life when expectations increase, and sometimes new and more complex skills are required for you to keep up. That's life, isn't it? It could be a major life transition, like a new job or moving house, but it might be a shift into a new stage of life, like a transition into early adulthood or parenthood. But burnout can also creep in slowly. So a person might feel worn down without really having any way that they can fully recharge. And those feelings can gradually affect home, work, social life, all in ways that they aren't even aware of because they're unable to see the bigger picture. And it is important to keep in mind that burnout isn't a personal failure, but it is just the result of trying to constantly keep up with these demands that take far too much energy and are frankly unsustainable for long periods of time. And that's why it's important for us to be able to spot the signs of autistic burnout in the workplace. Now, ONS, the Office of National Statistics, estimates that around 21% of autistic people are in employment. And because of that, it's highly likely that in almost every organisation, there will be autistic individuals employed. So if we explore how we can identify the signs of autistic burnout in the workplace and then actually understand how that can affect a person in work. So individuals experiencing autistic burnout can experience a wide range of symptoms that just make everyday tasks and everyday life a lot more challenging. And it will take a significant toll on their mental health, their physical health, and their overall levels of well-being. Now, as an employer, as a colleague even, it can be really difficult to spot the signs in staff. But actually, the main symptoms of autistic burnout to look out for can be maybe a little more obvious. And so there could be the physical symptoms of feeling unwell. Yeah. Now, autistic people experiencing burnout will and can experience the physical symptoms of illness. And that includes, exhaustion, fatigue, and maybe finding it difficult to get out of bed. Now, they can be slightly difficult maybe to spot, but there are a few things. So if someone's uncharacteristically late for work, they might be underperforming at regular tasks, or maybe taking more sick days than usual, or booking last-minute annual leave. That could be a bit of a red flag. Now, we've also got cognitive symptoms. So those symptoms might present as the inability to think clearly, process information, or solve problems. But it can also include things like struggling to concentrate, issues with both long and short-term memory. And those symptoms can be slightly easier to identify because people might be showing signs of lower productivity or the sudden inability to focus on the task at hand. Organisation comes into play as well, or lack thereof. So people experiencing autistic burnout often report finding it difficult to remain organised and to plan ahead. So that could present itself as poor time management skills or missing deadlines, things that will be quite easily flagged in work, and also meltdowns and shutdowns. So autistic burnout can be very difficult to manage emotionally, and it can make a person feel like they've lost control of their feelings. And again, they've lost that sense of self. Now, because of that, burnout is likely to cause an increase in meltdowns and shutdowns. And yet a shutdown can be harder to spot because an individual is likely to withdraw themselves from everyone. But if you are being hypervigilant, that withdrawal and self-isolation could be a really good starting point for a supportive conversation. But meltdowns will be a lot more obvious because they can involve verbally and physically lashing out. So things like shouting, crying, and even displaying symptoms of self-harm. Self-isolation is a biggie. Okay, so social interactions might become even more challenging for people with autism. That's going to be even more prominent during a period of autistic burnout. So because of that, they might be avoiding texts, calls, emails. It might take them longer to respond to contact than it usually would do because they have to emotionally prepare to communicate. It's not as straightforward as just answering a text or responding to an email. And then we've got mental health to consider, okay? Because there can be some serious implications of autistic burnout. And in some cases, it can lead to mental health conditions like anxiety, depression, mood disorders, and people can even exhibit suicidal behaviours. Now, preventing or recovering from burnout involves a combination of reducing demands and increasing support. And it might take some trial and error for you to find strategies that work best for any person. So I'm going to hand you over to Lizzie now, who'll discuss some of those strategies and give you an idea of what that support can actually look like in practice.
Thank you, Alice. Just a heads up that I'm having a little bit of an issue with my headset. So if you can't hear me at any point, please let me know. So super. Whilst I'll be talking you through some of those specific practical tips today, I want to begin by offering a starting point, which will place you in a really good position to foster that inclusive vibe in your team and support your colleagues in the workplace. So starting with a question, how do you work best? So I know that I work more effectively in the evening. I'm completely useless in the morning. And I definitely can't concentrate if there's any background noise whatsoever. It's just a distraction. So a great way to catalogue that information is through a ways of working agreement. Side note, you might have come across this in different names, different iterations, but it's pretty much the same thing. They're called work preference documents, personal work charters, those sorts of names, all for the same thing. So the purpose of the agreement is to establish on an individual level how someone works best in order to provide them with the most effective and supportive environment to actually work in. So you can find a number of templates online, but some starting questions could include, next slide please, Nikki. So you could ask things like, what time of day do you feel at your best? How do I prefer people to communicate with me? How much checking in do I need? Do I need someone who checks in with me regularly, or do I prefer to work autonomously? How do I prefer to have feedback delivered? What environment am I better in? And are there any additional kind of support needs for me to work on site? What are some indicators that I might need support, but maybe don't want to ask for it? And what makes me feel overwhelmed? How do I manage that overwhelm and that stress? And do I actually need some support in meetings? So this list is by no means exhaustive. It just gives you a little bit of an outline of what a ways of working discussion would look like. Whatever we're calling it, when these agreements are used team-wide, they can support colleagues and managers to recognise and support each other in a way that feels psychologically safe and authentic. So they create this inclusive team culture, which celebrates and accepts all our differences, whether we're autistic or not. For those of us whose needs do not fall within the neurotypical norm, seeing a team who outlines their needs from the outset and then respects the needs of their colleagues, that can increase the trust we then have in our team. And that environment can then enable us to feel safe enough to lower our mask without fear of judgment. Highlighting individual needs in such a way can also diminish that continuous burden placed on us to repeatedly identify our needs, which often feels very othering when you're constantly having to advocate for your own needs, but it can also be emotionally exhausting. And essentially, if you do this bit right, then where applicable, the rest of the strategies that I'll go through today would tie into this agreement. So before we explore strategies and workplace adjustments to support our autistic colleagues, I think it'd be useful for us to define what we mean by reasonable adjustments. So autism is covered by the Equality Act 2010, which aims to prevent discrimination or unfavourable treatment in respect of 9 protected characteristics. In this case, autism falls within disability. So employers have a legal obligation to implement reasonable adjustments in order to remove disadvantage. Equality here is a bit of a misnomer, as what the entire act is aiming for is actually equity, where every person is provided with what they personally need in order to achieve their potential. So thinking about more specific workplace adjustments then to support someone with autism. I'm going to break this down into a few different categories, and I'm going to offer you some practical strategies that you can use. It's by no means an exhaustive list, and the best approach will always be to ask someone who is autistic what adjustments would help them, as no two people are the same. There's a saying, which you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, and that could not be more true. Everybody is entirely different. So awareness and understanding is going to be our first one. Slide, please, Nikki. And then we're going to look at environment, and then we're going to look at communication. So awareness and understanding. Useful starting point is always increasing awareness of neurodiversity and autism. This could involve engaging in training personally, or perhaps arranging wider training for your team. So just the fact that you're here today shows that you are trying to raise awareness within yourself and possibly pass that information on to others. Raising awareness and educating ourselves can reduce the impact of unconscious bias, and it creates a supportive and psychologically safe atmosphere where autistic colleagues feel able to unmask and be their authentic selves. Because the point of this is, masking takes an incredible toll for someone who's autistic. Although I recognise that masking is quite it's an important skill that we develop in order to live in that neurotypical world. Being expected to have that mask all of the time it's unreasonable, and it's, to be honest with you, it's just not practical. So approaching adjustments flexibly is also key. Having an understanding that someone's needs might be changeable and relate to a number of other factors can make all the difference. For example, just because someone can attend the office 2 days this week, right, that feels fine. That doesn't mean that they can consistently do that. And it's important to recognise that the cumulative impact of these expectations is what eventually kind of leads to that burnout. So The next one that we're going to look at is environment. I think I forgot to tell you to skip a slide there, Nikki, sorry. So we're jumping a couple. There we go. So adjustments related to the environment can be hugely beneficial. Open plan, noisy offices have a hugely detrimental impact on most autistic people. The sensory overstimulation associated with the sounds, the lights, smells can be just completely exhausting. The pressure and the cognitive load of masking throughout the day then just adds to this fatigue, and you get this kind of social burnout. Not to mention the impact all of that has on our concentration. When you're spending all of your energy processing the sensory and the social elements in the environment, you have little capacity left to actually focus on your tasks and on your work. So where possible, it's useful to afford increased working from home and offer the flexibility to change office-based days in response to someone's needs. So I might say next week, Wednesday's a good day for me to attend the office, but then Tuesday, I'm pulled into a meeting all day, can't get out of it, I'm absolutely exhausted. Going into the office on Wednesday no longer feels doable, it no longer feels reasonable, okay? So having that flexibility to make those changes for around people's needs. I'm not for 1 second suggesting that all autistic people want to work from home all of the time, okay? Because it can be a beneficial, essentially, right? Working in the office does provide that social interaction that many autistic people do want, but they just want it in smaller quantities. So it can be a beneficial option to mitigate the energy expenditure associated with working in that typical office environment. So within the office itself, it can be helpful to offer quiet spaces to decompress and recharge. This is not always an easy option in modern offices because there's a lot of limited room availability, there's just space, there's just not the space. But quieter spaces can be achieved using things like acoustic boards, pods, soft furnishings, and they provide this much needed space for our autistic colleagues to take a break from socialising, to get away from that sensory stimuli for a little bit and just recharge. And on the topic of sensory processing, explore whether someone with autism would benefit from specialist equipment such as loop earplugs and noise cancelling headphones to limit their exposure to noise. Or there's also something called a supervisor light shield, which limits exposure to that harsh overhead lighting that most offices have. And it's quite a weird thing. It's like a big black matte panel that you move around on an arm, kind of put it in front of the light, and it just helps because it reduces that one little bit of sensory stimuli that you get in. So moving on to communication. Adjustments related to communication should always be considered, but this kind of harks back to our ways of working agreement and exploring communication preferences. So looking at some very specific adjustments or strategies then. Be clear in your communication, and lots of you are probably thinking, I always speak really clearly, but you would be surprised how much unspoken interpretation we're expecting others to do when we speak. Similarly to what we've highlighted today, this social processing can be so fatiguing for an autistic person. So I would challenge you all to ask yourself, have I overtly voiced the information that I wish to communicate? And that is the absolute key of clear communication. Have I said it, rather than have I said something that needs to then be processed? So providing meeting agendas and supplementary information in advance. This one also relates to what you're titling your meetings if you're having virtual meetings. So an example I have is working with someone who's autistic. She told me that going into a meeting that's just labelled catch up can be really daunting, because it gives you no clues to the purpose of that meeting, which then gives you no time to mentally prepare your mask. And it can evoke that real severe anxiety. Executive functioning differences are seen in neurodivergence and autism, so that can make it quite difficult to simultaneously read and process the information that you're giving me whilst interacting with you in a meeting. So send me the stuff in advance, because that cognitive load just adds to this fatigue that keeps accumulating and leads to burnout. So be very specific and be organised. What's your meeting about? Have you told me what your meeting is about? And are there any kind of materials, any reading that I need to do in advance? Have you given it to me? And this is my favourite little system. It's called a colour communication or a traffic light system. And it's really simple. And it's essentially an indicator system which involves placing something like a colour card on the desk to identify your current communication status. So it's kind of similar to what you actually have in Teams with the little red dot. But red means don't talk to me. Green, happy to socialise. And use of these can support people to make their needs clear in the moment contemporaneously. And this can also reduce distractions and improve concentration, and can be used to indicate that you are kind of having that bit of recharge time and you don't really feel like socialising. The nice thing about this system is you can get equipment that facilitates this. So you can get little office indicators, and they're like dials, and you turn the dial. And if everyone had one of those on their desk, everyone, right, it becomes less of a, oh, they've got that because they're autistic. No, we've all got it because we all have communication needs and we all respect each other's needs, and it works better that way. There's also something that I've seen implemented in a quite a large organisation, where there's a light above everyone's desk, and the light, you can switch it from green to red, and it basically tells people whether you're available to talk or not, which is just wonderful. So I've given you just a few ideas of workplace adjustments here. The list is honestly endless. But you could implement these and facilitate that safe, inclusive work culture. But I'd always emphasise that the most effective way to support an autistic person is to be open, to listen to their experience and not have any preconceived ideas, and be flexible in your approach to meeting that person's needs. So, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We're over to the question time now. We'll actually stop sharing my screen so that I can see your faces better. Thank you. Again, I say this every time, but I just learned so much from these, and that was so interesting because before this I'd never heard of masking or autistic burnout, so it's just been incredibly useful for me as well as our audience. And also what I've loved, I thank you so much to our audience. I've loved that there's in the chat people have been sharing really, you know, their experiences. That's exactly what we try to create with these webinars. Is also a sort of safe space for people to share their experiences amongst each other, which you have been doing. I've been struggling to sort of keep up with some of it, so thank you. And I'm glad that what our panelists have said has prompted some of these fantastic discussions. I will move over. We have got quite a few questions as well, so let me just bring up some questions for our panelists. So a few people have asked about, said how useful it is, some of the practical solutions that you discussed, Lizzie, but just in terms of if they're not in a kind of an office-based role, you know, are there any kind of practical adjustments where they maybe, somebody said about being a teacher, or if it's operate beyond what is operationally feasible, where, you know, how do you have these conversations and where's that line?
I think that's what you've touched on there is a really important point about operationally feasible. And operational feasibility feeds into reasonable adjustments. So is it reasonable for the business to put an adjustment in place? And I would argue that a lot of adjustments are absolutely feasible, and although it can be difficult to advocate for yourself, asking the business why something isn't feasible, you have every right to ask, right? And you have every right to expect an answer that makes sense. Okay, so that's the first kind of my first takeaway from that question. But the other part of that, I would jump back to that ways of working agreement as always the first place to start with adjustments, purely because it asks all the questions about, like, what do you need, what do you find challenging, what are you good at, where do you work best. All those questions, they apply in other settings. A lot of what I have suggested are very office based, but I would say that we don't just assess people in offices, we assess people in a whole range of places, and there are always adjustments that can be put in place. It's just getting to know the autistic individual and their job.
Thank you. Quite a few people have asked the question about having an employee that they feel is autistic, but the employee isn't necessarily, hasn't necessarily either been, diagnosed or it isn't at that stage where they're willing to discuss it, how you would sort of broach those conversations?
Alice? I would ask the question, is the diagnosis relevant in that context? Because when we're talking about it, you're asking realistically because you want to potentially implement reasonable adjustments to make that employee's life easier, to make them more productive, to make them happier in work. A diagnosis, or then telling you that they have a diagnosis, isn't relevant because you can still help that person in work by asking the right questions. So, what are the barriers? What can I do to help you? What have you got any suggestions about what would make your life easier? Let's try and meet in the middle, because a diagnosis is wonderful for some people, makes a significant difference in their level of self-belief, and it's justified a potential lifetime of anguish. And yes, it helps when the Equality Act comes into play, but having a piece of paper that says I have autism, I'm autistic, that is not going to impact your ability to do your job at the end of the day, and you're already there, that's already your colleague. So it's irrelevant. And I appreciate it's might be a slight cop out of an answer, but that is irrelevant. If you feel that person needs support, give them that support, diagnosis or not.
Fantastic. John has come back actually. John was one of the audience members that asked a question around this, but perhaps if the person themselves doesn't suspect that they're neurodiverse, so it's not actually not the diagnosis as such, but if it's something that the employer has identified, but the person themselves is very sensitive around that topic, is there anything that, in terms of addressing conversations around that, where somebody is not sort of mentioned it?
Honestly, it's kind of the same answer. For me, it's the same answer, because the reason that you have these, for want of a better word, suspicions, is because there was potentially a barrier in the workplace and you want to be able to help that person. Would you still help that person if they were neurotypical? Well, yeah, because you're still going to support your employee, you're still going to support your colleague. And so that would be my view on it. Lizzie, would you add anything else to that?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to that, and to be honest, it fits very much with what Alice is saying, but the whole, I do harp on about this, I'll be honest, but the whole ways of working agreement, right, it is ideal for everyone. Everyone in your team would benefit from a ways of working agreement, whether they're autistic or not. And actually, if the entire team has one of these agreements, well, then that becomes normal in your team, for want of a better word. And then that can actually facilitate the discussions that you want to have with that person. And it never needs to be about them being possibly neurodivergent. That it's just about their needs and their preferences.
Great answers. Thank you. Quite a few people have asked actually from a personal level, and it's been really interesting, especially in the chat, that some people on the chat have never heard of masking and realized, oh my gosh, this is why I'm so shattered and what I've been doing all my life. So are there any kind of just personal tips to protect yourself from burnout that you can offer? Lizzie's looking nodding already. Are there any personal tips?
I'm laughing because that's a tough question. For me, I would just say making sure that I factor in plenty of time to recharge. Don't put back-to-back meetings in like I have done today. But yeah, try not to do that. Advocating for yourself, which again, I can't stress enough how hard I know that is. It's very easy for me to sit on a screen and tell you to advocate for yourself, but have confidence in you are allowed to ask for what you need, and you should feel confident to do that. If you don't, I would say that there's something wrong in the environment that you're in.
Okay, thank you. A few people have asked about access to work, so I don't know if that's anything that somebody can provide information on. Totally unaware of it, and how can it help?
So I'm going to jump in again. Sorry, guys. Access to work. So I used to be an access to work assessor years ago, and essentially, access to work is a government scheme. You can access all the information on it on the .gov.uk website, and it's available to anyone with a disability. Now, the interesting thing that people don't always know is that disability doesn't actually have to be diagnosed. So even if you are undiagnosed or waiting for a diagnosis, you can still access support through Access to Work. Access to Work can provide a funding grant towards special aids and equipment, towards coaching or like one-on-one support from an actual person. And they also have a mental health support service. There's actually quite a lot that you can get through Access to Work. To do that, just go to the government website, do the application form. It's quite self-explanatory, and essentially they'll get in contact with you.
Fantastic. A couple of people asked about, I wonder how many autistic people are diagnosed with sleep apnea. Is that a few people have mentioned sleep apnea?
Yeah, I saw those. So there's no trend in it. It's not necessarily linked, as it were. Sleep apnea is a lot more common than people realize because of the way that we've evolved, essentially, and because of how our lifestyles have changed quite drastically over the last 100 years. Sleep apnea has become a lot more prevalent for a variety of reasons. And I think it might just be essentially a correlation of sleep apnea is more prevalent, more people are being diagnosed with, as neurodivergent. So I think it might just be that's the correlation, and not that it's necessarily, it's more common in, neurodivergent individuals. I haven't been able to find any writing on it. There are no papers published or anything, so I'm not 100% sure there is a direct connection at the moment. That might change. Science changes.
Yeah, no, that's good. No, it's a good point, actually. More people are being diagnosed with both, so it naturally seems like a link when maybe there's not. Let me just have a look at the time. Okay, I'll just check. Quite a few people, this is not a question, but just saying, we've still got this sort of people saying they're glad about claiming back the autistic term as well, that they don't find that, it went through that phase, like you said, Alice and Kim, but it's actually, they don't find it offensive at all, and are very proud to describe themselves as autistic, which is fantastic.
It's swinging in the other way in some contexts now. Some people are going, oh, I don't like they have autism. It 100% goes back to what Kim said, though. It's preference. Same with the word disability. Disability is not a dirty word. We don't need to be afraid of the word disability, but it's the potential negative connotations associated with disability, which is why we focus on diversity and difference, because the words associated with diversity and difference are typically more positive than the negative words associated with disability. But it's not a bad word at all. I mean, I'm sure Kim's got lots of thoughts on the language side of things.
Thank you. Final question, probably left this one, it's probably not got enough time to answer it in full, and I think we definitely need to do an FAQ document off the back of this webinar, because we've had so many questions, lots of themes as well that we've just not been able to cover. So we will do an FAQ document, so bear with us on that. We'll get that out over the next sort of week or so. But just about how can workplaces look at their what can they do with their recruitment process so that it's more inclusive for autistic people? Lizzie's smiling again.
I think that's a really, really good question. And we're already seeing some positive changes in certain organisations who are providing like the interview questions in advance, because the whole job interview scenario, it's very inauthentic anyway. It's inauthentic for someone who's neurotypical, but for someone who's neurodivergent, you're now trying to mask to that neurotypical norm, right? But you're also doing a double mask, because you're actually masking again, how do you behave in a job interview? Like, it becomes even more challenging. And I like the fact that, you know, they're giving out interview questions in advance, but I think there needs to be quite a lot of research done in this area as to what can we do to recruit people instead of the typical job interview, because it's just so exclusive.
Yeah, 100%. And I echo the interview questions in advance. I've had so many people say to me, well, that's not fair, because that's giving people an advantage. It isn't. It's evening the playing field. That's the way that you look at it, because neurotypical people naturally have the advantage. A time many moons ago, being neurodivergent was beneficial. Neurodivergent people has kept man alive. With the campfire people, with the people that stayed up all night, looked after everyone else. The corporate world of 9 to 5 doesn't fit with the neurodivergent brain. We've kind of been left behind a little. And my final thoughts on that was aim to become a disability confident leader, because ultimately one of the things that we look at is the recruitment process, the hiring process from start to finish. Because even if you think you're an inclusive employer, you'd be surprised at the hurdles that you might be falling down at.
Great answers. Leveling the playing field. I like that. So thank you so much to our fantastic panelists. Thanks ever so much to our audience. You've been wonderful, really engaging. Yeah, so as I say, tomorrow you'll receive a link to the recording. I'll also pop in, because there were some questions about the neuroplastic URL and stuff like that. So some of those questions I'll cover in the email tomorrow, but we'll also work behind the scenes to get an FAQ document out in the next sort of week or so. But huge thank you. We've got lots of lovely comments coming up. Lovely. Thank you so much, and have a lovely afternoon.